Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Tobias Eigen, and I am the community builder here in the Global Legal Empowerment Network. It's Wednesday, February 14th. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. Today's topic is women and land rights. Before we get too far into today's proceedings, I have some brief housekeeping. First, take note that this webinar is being recorded. We will share the full recording and highlights later on our website. I also want to make sure that you can hear well and are able to use our webinar system. Please look for a questions pane where you can type in your questions and communicate with us. Please try it right now. Tell us where you're coming from, and if you have one, a burning question about today's topic. I'll wait right here while you put in some questions. Can you see the questions pane? I'll just leave it open for a moment for you to put in your questions. Great. Some questions are starting to come through. Great. We have Jenny Bell from KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. We have Danny asking how many participants. So far, we're at about 20. But we did get 80 registrants. So in the next couple of minutes, I'm sure we'll get a few more people coming in. We have Tatena from CCSI. Has no questions at the moment. Great. Well, if you have any burning questions, why don't you go ahead and use that questions pane to put them in as we move along. Any questions at all? Now, there's also a button for raising your hand to get our attention. Why don't you show us that you know how that works by taking a moment to raise your hand right now. Great. I'm seeing Camilla's raised her hand. Danny's raised his hand. Jenny again, thank you. Madeline Weber, Thiessen, Rebecca Thiessen. Wigai Kisando, lovely to see you here, Wigai. Great. So we're getting a lot of people raising their hands. Again, if you're have any questions as we move along, you can raise your hand. All right. I'd also like to introduce you to the Global Legal Empowerment Network. The network is a growing community of more than 1,400 organizations and 5,000 individuals from around the world who are working to advance justice, be it in land rights, citizenship rights, the right to health or education, or any other sector where injustice persists. Members include human rights activists and grassroots organizers, advocates and educators, lawyers and community paralegals, researchers, policymakers, and sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Members include human rights activists and grassroots organizers, advocates and educators, lawyers, community paralegals, researchers, policymakers, and public servants. Through the network, these practitioners from all across regions and disciplines are able to come together to collaborate and learn from one another. Both online and through in-person events, we share ideas, challenges, best practices, and resources. How do we do this? Well, as most of you already know, we connect through an online forum which you can access from your laptop, tablet, or smartphone. We discuss problems on the forum and share ideas, solutions, and opportunities. We're a friendly bunch, so we hope you decide to come to the forum, spend time there regularly. We also learn from one another through webinars like this one and in face-to-face learning exchanges, leadership courses, and other events, all of which we announce on the network discussion platform. Additionally, there's an online library, which today has more than 1,500 free legal empowerment resources, such as training materials, monitoring and evaluation tools, case management forms, academic research, and more. So do hope you come and use the library, add your resources, and benefit from everything you find there. Last but not least, we do advocacy. We work together to campaign on issues that affect us globally and nationally, such as our campaign that helped to ensure the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals included a goal specifically on access to justice. You can join the network on our website at namati.org. Membership is free and open to all. Just complete a sign-up form and you're in. We will be getting in touch with all of you after the webinar with the link to invite you to join. So great. I am now going to go ahead and introduce Abigail Moy, who will be moderating this webinar. Abby is the director of the Global Legal Empowerment Network. She will take us forward for the rest of the hour. Abby, over to you.
Thank you, Tobias. It is a pleasure to see you all. Right now, we're getting a lot more comments and questions from folks online. As Tobias said, there's over 20 people right now joining us, and there will be more, I'm assuming, as the webinar goes on. I just wanted to say that it's a pleasure to be initiating this conversation. This is the beginning of a series of webinars that are focused on women's rights and legal empowerment. So please stay tuned after this webinar for news about upcoming ones that might touch on your areas of interest. In this particular area, it's my honor to introduce Rachel Knight. She is the Special Advisor for Land at Namati. Her expertise is in areas of land tenure security, access to justice, and legal empowerment of the poor. Over the last several years, she's been working with over 150 communities across 7 countries to explore methods for helping communities protect their land claims. She's also been advising several governments on how to write fair land laws, ones that particularly integrate protections for women's rights. In addition to Rachel, we're going to have a couple of folks from one of our partners, the Land and Equity Movement in Uganda, particularly Teresa Ailu, and she, and as well as hopefully another colleague, David Arak, will be sharing some of their perspectives about the experiences of implementing methods and techniques for empowering women on the ground on the grassroots level. I really want to organize this webinar as more of a conversation. So after the presentations and some of the inputs by our colleagues, we'd like to open up the floor and really have more of an interactive, open dialogue about some of the ideas, suggestions, and even some of the more kind of provocative recommendations that we may be posing during the course of this webinar. While you're listening to the webinar, please do, as questions arise, pose them in the questions panel. We're going to be keeping track of all the questions from participants and organizing them in a way to have a really rich discussion afterwards. So you don't have to wait until the end. Just give us your input, your questions while we go along, and we'll try to address them by throughout the webinar. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Rachel.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here on this webinar with all of you. I am sitting in my new rented apartment in Mozambique, where I'll be for the next month, and I happened to accidentally rent an apartment directly across the street from the Ministry of Women and Gender. So I'm at this moment staring into the offices of hardworking government officials who are working for women's rights. So I thought you might all appreciate that. My internet is not that awesome, so I wrote a lot of text on the slides. Please let me know if you can't hear me or if my internet is breaking up. So the title of this presentation is It Takes a Village, Strengthening and Protecting Women's Land Rights. And I have 2 slides on background, and I'll just do them quickly now. Can you go forward? Whoever is moving the slides forward, can you go forward?
Hi, Rachel, I did move it forward. It just takes a minute. I see
great.
Background.
Great. So I have 2 slides on background just to frame the debate and the discussion for everyone today. The first one is about custom, but this is particularly relative to Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, but I've found in my work in other parts of the world that many of these concepts do also apply to Asia, parts of Asia and Latin America. In many cultures, land is inherited patrilineally. It's passed from fathers to sons, and the alternative is matrilineal, where it's passed from mothers to daughters, also through aunts. However, in most of these cultures, men do not own the land. Land is owned as a family by all family members, male and female, and not only living ones. Land is owned by all ancestors and by all future generations. It's only the living ones who have a responsibility to manage the land on behalf of the entire family. In the past, customary land tenure models included protections for women's rights. However, the population growth is a full vertical up, and the more people there are and the fewer land there is to go around. And as a result, there's more land scarcity and a resulting rise in massive competition for land. And this is leading more powerful family members, in-laws, brothers, uncles, to reinterpret and, quote, rediscover customary rules that maybe didn't exist in the past, but because it wasn't written down, they're saying, oh, it's our custom to kick widows off their land, et cetera, et cetera. In this context, the very people given the responsibility to protect the land rights of female relatives become the ones who dispossess them. Trends such as widow dispossession are actually not custom. They are like the adulteration of custom. So the next background slide is that there's an intense debate about what to do about all of this. Many women's land right advocates are pushed for individual titling in women's names. And I'm sure there's some of you on this call, and I look forward to your frustration with me, and we can have a great debate about it. And I completely am a fan of individual women's land rights and women's land titles in urban and peri-urban areas and densely populated regions like Rwanda, where individual titling is standard practice. This is awesome. It's great to have women's titles, men's titles, joint titles for husbands and wives. I'm a big fan of that, where titling is the norm. However, in rural areas where titling is not the norm, I believe that individual land titling strategies, especially in the name of women's rights, are a neo-colonial, neoliberal imposition of Western ideology imposed on villagers to create a land market so land could be more easily appropriated from rural farmers. It's once land is titled and put in a document, it's much, much easier to sell it or say, oh, put your land up as collateral for a loan. And then when the woman can't repay the loan, the land is taken. There's a huge history of this in the United States when the, I would say colonizers, when the settlers in the United States wanted to grab all the lands from Native Americans, they said, oh, we'll just put it in your individual titles. Whereas most Native Americans had owned land as a group. And it was a very easy way to then swindle them out of all of their titles. Moreover, in rural Africa, individuals do not own land, families do. There's also a statistic that says, you know, women do 90% of the labor, but they only own 10% of the land. This is a false fact. It's been flying around the internet for a long time, and a wonderful academic named Cheryl Das actually did the research and found that on average, across 10 countries in Africa, only 12% of women report owning land, but meanwhile, only 31% of men do either. So it's not like women own 10% of the land, or women own 12% of the land, and men own, 88% of the land. No, it's that most people don't identify as owning land individually. And more importantly, emerging research has also shown that securing titles for women in rural Africa actually may endanger them and undermine their ability to protect their land claims. There's been a couple of studies that show a link between women seeking individual titles and increased gender-based violence. And just a personal story here, when I think about all these people saying women need to get their own land rights, and when women marry into a family, they need to get an individual title, I often think about my own family, where my mother and father and sister and I have a piece of land that's 20 acres. And I can't even imagine if I married a man and then after a couple of years we divorced and he said, oh, actually, some of that 20 acres is mine. I think me and my entire family would be very angry and say, no way, we've had this land in our family for over 30 years. You can't just marry in for a little while and then claim a huge piece of it as your own. That's just not the way it works. And even in Western society, we have prenuptial agreements and all kinds of things to keep wealth and assets in families. And to say that African families don't deserve those same kinds of rights is very questionable to me. Anyway, next slide. And I look forward to you guys really attacking me about this. There's a lot of good arguments on the other side. These are just my ideas. I think this is not the right version of the PowerPoint because the slides are in a different order. Maybe go forward one. But here you're giving away the punchline. Go forward a slide. sorry. So in 2009, we did a huge randomized control trial. We did a baseline, and we asked how to best ensure that the land rights of vulnerable groups are protected. And as you can see from the chart in front of you, a stronger family member must protect and customary community leaders must protect. So we asked, you know, if you were going to protect the land rights of women, how would you go about doing it? And overwhelmingly, all the protections that people most voted for were within the community, either family members or community leaders. State land officials are a close third, but you see that calling a paralegal or a lawyer is actually less frequently than the woman must fight for the land claims all by herself. So in this context, the data really made clear that protections for women's land rights have to start within the community and the family. And this is because access to justice is very, very hard in rural communities. It's even harder than access to healthcare. And to ask that a woman who may have lots of children and be afraid and have very insecure rights in her family would have the courage and strength to maybe find the money necessary to take some kind of transportation into the most nearest city where she may not even speak the national language and look for help defending her land rights is really a big ask of vulnerable populations. So my question is, we now go back to the slide that had the core question. The central question is, how then to make women's land rights real as practiced on the ground by families and communities in the normal course of their lives in a way that honors the wisdom of African or indigenous customs and cultures rather than replacing locally valid practices with imported Western paradigms. Next slide. Next one. So in my opinion, and again, I'm being a little bit incendiary, I think that people who say that the only way to protect women's rights is through individual titling are just being a little uncreative. I think there's a million different ways to protect women's rights, but most importantly, it's necessary to really work to change the local customs, but not replace them within which women's land rights are embedded, creating a 360-degree safety net. And Teresa will talk a lot more about that when it's her turn, because Lingwu does amazing work on this. But just some quick discussion of this is that one things you can do is, sorry, this is not the most updated version of this PowerPoint. I totally changed it. I'll just read from mine and you'll have to just deal with it. So first, the thing is starting at the national level, creating a strong enabling environment through advocacy and education campaigns, using radio, television, theater, billboards, etc. So I was just talking with amazing group of advocates last week in Kenya from all around the world, and they were talking about amazing billboard campaigns that showed good-looking, strong, well-dressed men like passing each other condoms back in the 1990s during AIDS. And it became a very cool, because of this phenomenally successful billboard ad, it became a very cool thing for men who wanted to be awesome to like carry condoms with them. And similarly in Liberia, there was a series of billboards about like real men don't hit women, you know, and they were really sexy, good looking men talking about how domestic violence is wrong. And I think that the land rights community could be doing a much better use of media and social media to really getting the idea out that cool men and awesome guys don't actually dispossess women of their land rights. And then also not only educating women, but also men and leaders of women's land rights. The domestic violence movement has been incredibly successful when it turned towards men and boys to talk about how hitting women is wrong. And I think we could do amazing campaigns in schools and with youth groups, et cetera, to talk about the importance of women having economic power and land rights, strong land rights, et cetera. Also training customary leaders in the village to mediate family land disputes in a gender equitable manner and according to national laws. In my experience, customary leaders in villages are actually quite eager to know about what national law is, and they are more excited than most people imagine to be like, oh, I'm gonna mix custom and the Constitution, because there's an excitement about what the Constitution says and things like that. And so if you can train customary leaders to mix both customary and statutory law, there's ways that they can make much better judgments when they're mediating between disputes. And also people who do dispute resolution are often neglected in the development world as the mediators of so many of these injustices. And so using these customary leaders to improve their conflict resolution strategies and align them more with the Constitution is definitely an underused strategy. Using community-based paralegals who are in the community teaching about land rights, teaching about women's rights. And then a really wonderful strategy that Roots Kenya invented is supporting and creating community watchdog groups, who are groups of women in the community who are alert for instances of land dispossession from women, who can just act right there in a group of 5 women just going over and saying, what's happening right here? And calling maybe the local paralegal and creating a on-the-ground group of women who are empowered and checking to make sure nothing bad is happening. And then finally, supporting the creation of gender equitable community bylaws, which is what I'm going to talk about briefly now. The bylaws drafting process is part of Namati's, next slide. Next slide. Hello?
I just advanced it.
Uh-oh. Maybe it's just not advancing on my computer.
Okay, I've been trying to switch to the correct slides, but it looks like maybe that's not working.
It's okay.
Well, so what are you seeing?
You can
on
see
your
here,
what slide?
Diagram.
What slide are you seeing?
It's a diagram. I'm seeing 2 slides now. Next slide, the current slide.
Okay.
There, well, now I can see 2 slides. But anyway, this slide is a really big overview of Namati's community land protection process. We have 5 steps. The first is laying the groundwork. The second one is harmonizing boundaries and documenting.
Ugh. Sorry, I'm struggling a little bit with my system. I'm not hearing you at the moment. Are you able to hear me?
Tobias, I can hear you, but I cannot hear Rachel. One moment. Sorry, everyone, for technical difficulties. Rachel is talking. I can hear her very, very faintly, but not very well.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Oh, she's back. She's back. There's no PowerPoint.
Okay. Sorry.
Rachel, so you dropped off. You were just introducing the 5 steps. If you could just rewind.
Should I just share my screen? Should I just share my screen?
I see it now. I saw that there are 5 steps is up. So I think we're good.
Okay,
so if you could start.
And you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine now.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. Okay, so this is Namati's community land protection process. I'm going to go over it really fast because we're running out of time. But I just want to point out we have 5 steps. The first one is laying the groundwork, where we enter the community and help everyone understand the importance of protecting their land rights. The second step is strengthening community governance of land and natural resources. The third step is resolving land conflicts, harmonizing boundaries, and documenting lands. The fourth step is pursuing legal recognition. And the 5th step is helping the community live out its bylaws, protect its natural resources, and prepare to prosper. And also learn how to negotiate in an empowered way with potential investors or say no to those investors. So next slide, I'm going to talk about very briefly our bylaws drafting process. So our bylaws drafting process is the heart of where we work on women's land rights. And strengthening women's land rights is one of the core objectives of our work when we work to protect community lands. And just to be clear, we're not working on individual family lands or even individual lands. We're working as the entire outer boundary of the community, including forests, waterways, grazing lands, mountains, and all the family land within the community. And so our bylaws drafting process begins with a community-wide brainstorming of past and current rules. So we'll say, what are your previous rules or current rules for your leaders? What are your rules? Tell us all your rules about how you manage your lands and natural resources. What kind of rules do you have for forests, for water, etc.? What are your social and cultural rules? And people will just shout out all their existing rules and rules that their ancestors had for up to 3 hours. We write them all down in 3 different categories: governance, natural resource management, and social and cultural rules. And people will say things like, you know, don't cut trees along the riverbank so the rivers don't erode, or don't put chemicals in the water, and things like that. And then we'll say, okay, come back next week or in a couple of weeks and say, let's look at all your rules now and let's think about what rules do you need to add that are missing? What rules do you need, and that which you need to prepare yourselves for the future, because life changes and customary rules need to continue to align with the times. What rules do you need to change because they go against the Constitution, or they violate human rights, or they're not really working, or what rules do you need to get rid of, and just basically how do we change all these rules? And then we'll work in small groups of women, youth, and men, and have them meet in advance, especially the women. We have them do women's conferences where they meet in advance and they plan what kind of rules they want to change and how they want to advocate for women's rights. And so they go into these second draft discussions, often with an agenda and a plan. And then we break the second draft of the bylaws is really long. It takes like 3 months, and we'll have meetings by topic. So there'll be a whole meeting about membership in the community, which is where we talk about women's rights a lot of the time, or land and natural resource management, and that'll be a whole meeting on forests and grazing land, and a whole meeting on water and things like that. After they finish their second draft, we give the bylaws to either a judge or a lawyer to do a legal or technical analysis. Anything that goes against the Constitution, the community will revise those rules so that their rules are completely in line with national law. And then they'll formally adopt their rules by consensus or supermajority vote, and then use those rules to elect a diverse representative land governance council, which usually is required by the community's new laws to include women and youth and people of minority groups, etc. And I just want to explain a few things about this process because it feels important. One of the ways we've been extremely successful at having communities make their bylaws much more protective of women's rights, and particularly in having community members enshrine a role for women in land governance, is that we don't try to say men and women are identical or they have the same rights. What we try to show through the community's own work is that men and women have very equal but different knowledge according to their traditional livelihoods and roles. Like, for example, one of our core activities is we'll have the women, the men, and the youth all draw a sketch map of their community and what all the natural resources are inside of it. And by and large, in most communities, the men will map like 3 or 4 natural resources that align with men's livelihoods, like where the cattle go and the things that the men are in charge of, like building materials for homes. But then women, who have a much wider range of tasks, will often put 2 or 3 times the amount of natural resources on their map. And when they present it to the community, the men are like, oh, we forgot that, or we didn't know that was there. And the women are mapping, you know, white ants and wild yams and traditional medicines and things like that. That men, in their purview as men and doing men's work, they may not know where they are or how to find them. And so by showing rather than telling men that women's voices are important, men are like, oh, land is not just land is natural resources. We actually must include women's voices, otherwise our rules are not going to be inclusive enough, etc. The second tactic we use that really works is asking men, you know, who are saying, no, women don't own land, women have to get evicted after their husband dies. We say, what would you want to happen to your daughter or your granddaughter? Is that what you'd want to happen to her? And we make it really personal. We really ask men to think about these rules that they're suggesting being applied to their most beloved women in their lives. A third tactic we have is we ask the community, what kind of community are you? Are you the kind of community that puts widows on the street? Are you the kind of community that leaves like young girls with no land and nowhere to go, girls who haven't gotten married? Or, you know, basically we look at the rules they're proposing. We ask them a series of questions of like, is that who you are? Is that how you want to be as a community? Don't you want to protect and provide for your most vulnerable members, etc.? Abby, how am I doing on time? I feel like I've been talking for a long time. Can you hear me?
Sorry, I was on mute. It's 9:30. We did have some technical difficulties, so I didn't know how much to kind of adjust for that. But let's, because I also think We have a lot of questions.
Yep.
Give us a few more minutes. I would, make sure you're touching on the major points, but just know that we have a very rich discussion coming up. So
Awesome.
The next 5 minutes.
I'll wrap up.
Okay.
Next slide, please. I'll go quick. There's 3 more slides. I'll be fast. Next slide, anyone?
Patience.
Okay.
It takes a little moment. Sorry.
So I just want to be clear that women's participation in bylaws drafting strategies actually has 4 components. And during our meeting in Kenya, where we had some of the best land rights protectors in the entire world gathered in one room, we had like a full shout out brainstorm about how to address this. Usually people say women's participation in meetings, they mean women's attendance at meetings. And often NGOs just kind of get into the lazy strategy of just counting how many women came to the meetings. Getting women to meetings is definitely a challenge, but getting them to speak and talk and share their views at meetings is even harder. And then even harder than that is making sure that women are listened to, heard, and that their ideas are impacting final community decisions. And then even harder than that is making sure that women take part in land governance actively and are elected as leaders and given authentic authority and decision-making power. And I have a very long list that the group of us shouted out and brainstormed. And it's interesting because all across the world, in many, many different cultures that were represented at this meeting, everyone had a hard time getting women to meetings, getting women speaking at meetings. It was really challenging to all of us. And if there's time, I'll explain some of these strategies, but I'm just going to go forward so that we can finish and get right to the discussion. So the impacts and outcomes of Namati's bylaws drafting process is that it provides an opportunity for women to actively challenge discriminatory norms and argue for the inclusion of protections for their land and inheritance rights. I'm on the next slide, just so you know. So what our work does, it tends to result in the strengthening of existing women's rights that are not yet written down. By writing them down and having the community talk about them, they actually get strengthened and reinforced, especially for youth. Number 2, it helps with the rejuvenation of customary norms that existed in the past to protect women's land claims and may have fallen away. Before colonization, there's a lot of history and evidence that before colonization, women's rights were actually much stronger in many of these societies. So sometimes the bylaws discussion can rejuvenate customary indigenous norms that actually protect women quite strongly, and the alignment of local rules with national laws to protect women's rights. We've also seen changes in community perceptions of women's involvement in land governance. A long time ago, we did some research from 2009 in Uganda, and women said, before the protection work, they said, the leaders underlook us. They say women don't have important points to make. We're considered inferior. Men think we have nothing useful to contribute. The leaders minimize us, et cetera. And then after going through the whole bylaws process with really excellent facilitators, women said, our opinions were used to make final decisions. At the end of the day, the written document represents our opinions too. We were all considered the same as the men when giving views. Yes, we had the opportunity to participate and our opinions were always taken. And these were in the same communities where the women had said we were not listened to. And we also talked to men who said, okay, we realize women do have good things to say. We listen to women now, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, something that's really interesting is that women use the bylaws drafting process to argue for more than just land rights. In every single community, they argued for rules against domestic violence. And there's a really wonderful story that I like to tell that just came out about a year ago from a community in Uganda, where there was a man in the community who beat his wife way more than all other men. I'll call him Mr. Igaru. And this community was so appalled by how much he beat his wife that they made an entire rule. Number 18, Mr. Igaru should not beat his wife. And then about a few months later, this man's wife came forward to one of Lemu's facilitators and said, it's really working. And she told him the story that she sleeps with the bylaws written under her pillow. And every time her husband comes home drunk, she pulls the bylaws and puts them in her face and says, number 18, and he doesn't beat her. And this man, it's now become a community joke, and now his nickname is number 18. And when he shows up at the local drinking spot, everyone hails him as, hey, number 18. So there's a power to bylaws drafting that allows the community to address not only land rights, but other social ills that disempower women. In conclusion, next slide. I wrote this out just so if I talk too fast, but basically to protect women's rights rather than seeking individual titles, we need to create comprehensive community-wide safety nets that include customary leaders, men, women, youth, police, and local land administrators. And the second main point is that rather than seeking individual titles for women, it's necessary to support the community to create intra-community mechanisms and systems that ensure women's lands and natural resource rights are protected. So the final slide is, if you want to know more about all of this, you can see Namati's Facilitator's Guide to Community Land Protection. And there is a link to that guide on the final slide, if you can go forward. There we go. All right, and that's it. That's it for me. I strongly urge you guys to check this guide out. We have a bunch of chapters on how to support women's land rights in the bylaws drafting process and in community land protection efforts. So that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's a really valuable contribution to hear how we can engage customary legal systems in a lot of plural legal systems that exist around the world when trying to empower women and their land rights. Too often, I think sometimes we focus a bit too much on the policy or the institutional aspects of this challenge. So I think it really addresses a gap. Teresa, if you're there, I would love if you could just share some of your experiences in actually implementing a lot of the strategies that Rachel has just described, especially your thoughts on this 360-degree safety net. Can we unmute Teresa? While we're doing that, I just want to introduce her. Teresa is the former program director of LEMU, the Land and Equity Movement of Uganda. And currently, she is pursuing a PhD in Makerere University.
So Abby, I'm not sure I have the best news. I've been corresponding with Teresa on email, and she says she's trying to join, but it rejects her email and password. So unfortunately, she's not succeeding in getting in.
The technology gods are not cooperating today.
Exactly. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. We actually, it looks like we have a lot, and this is, we're looking forward to an open dialogue. We actually have a lot of people right now who are experts in their own right in a lot of these areas. So I'm going to start with some of the questions that people are posing, but rather than just ask them to Rachel, can I ask all of the participants for their contributions as well? What you can do is you can either raise your hand if you have an interesting contribution or a solution to one of the questions posed, and we'll call on you, or you can type into the questions pane that you want to be called on or unmuted, or if you don't want to speak, you can just type in some of your responses. So to begin, there is a number of questions that talk about how to integrate women into multi-stakeholder discussions on policy making. So I did mention, for instance, that Rachel advises governments on creating land laws. She didn't quite touch on this as much in this presentation, but it sounds like some people are interested in really making sure that women's perspectives are integrated into policies and laws. Right now, they seem to reflect men's perspectives. One person out of many who've asked questions along these lines is Sibrabrata Chaudhry, and maybe Tobias, if Sibrabrata is with us, if we can unmute and actually have them pose the questions themselves.
Sure, I'll do that right now.
Okay.
Okay, you're unmuted.
Sibrabrata, you're now unmuted. If you wanted to pose a question.
Yeah. Hi. Good. Hi, everybody. Thank you for this webinar. And first of all, I was really impressed by the experience that Rachel shared about the whole community involving and um, getting ensuring rights of women. But the challenge that we are facing here in India is, even though there is a law which guarantees land rights for women, so we are facing issues how to involve the women, particularly in rural areas and also in urban areas. How to work closely with the government institutions, because most of the officials there also male, and they come with a similar kind of background. So the example that Rachel shared about involving the whole community, both the community leaders and men, so that is inspiring. But I would like to learn about or know about how to institutionalize this within the government framework.
Thank you, Subavrata. That is a really important question. Rachel, can you perhaps initially share your thoughts? And again, I encourage folks on the webinar, could you raise your hand or type your contributions as well into the questions pane, because I know some of you, I see some of your names, I know some of you have some expertise in this area. Go ahead, Rachel.
I feel a little foolish speaking about India because I know so little about your legal context, so I apologize. But what I've seen in many countries, and I know does apply to India somewhat, is the idea of user groups who are in charge of managing certain resources. I believe India does have forest management user groups who manage forests that cut across maybe a variety of villages, and they have elected leaders. And I believe in India, there's even a constitutional requirement that something like 1/3 or 1/2 of the officers of those forest management groups must be women, right? So, and again, correct me if I'm wrong. I apologize. But in my experience is that often the rules for how the forest should be managed are not drafted by the entire community as a whole, or the rules for how the watershed should be managed are not drafted by everybody in a really intense series of meetings that starts with custom and tradition and indigeneity, and questions about who the community is and what they want for their future, and then really opening up the discussion to women and people of lower castes and minority ethnic groups that don't usually have a voice. And that's where good outside facilitation or really strong leadership comes in. And when the rules are made by, for example, hunters or even homeless families that really rely on the forest in different ways or rely on the grazing land in different ways, or the fallow land, or whatever the word in India is, when you're really working at a watershed or an ecosystem level, there's different kinds of users, and all those voices can be incorporated, especially women's voices. And once you get all of women's opinions and ideas about how to manage the land or the forest or the watershed, and really show men and particularly leaders that women have really good inputs into those discussions, then they can, when they are elected to be officers of those management groups, there's more of a fertile ground for their opinions to be taken seriously. I've heard stories that in some communities women run for office, but they're because of the constitutional requirement, but then their husbands actually are the ones that actually sit in the meetings because of deep-seated misogyny or whatever. But to me, the real challenge is you can make the laws that say that women have to be on the committees as leaders, but it's really driving home how important their opinions and ideas and their expertise and their knowledge is, and really showing rather than forcing men and male leaders that women have expertise that men don't have, and that to really protect the entire ecosystem thoroughly, women's voices are important. So I apologize for my ignorance. I hope I haven't misspoken with my very skeletal knowledge of India, but I hope that's helpful.
Thanks. I saw someone's hand go up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sonali Mohapatra, I saw your hand go up and go down again. So if you are still interested in contributing, we would love to hear from you. put your hand up again if you're interested. There's a kind of very related question that is posed by Marlon Manuel. I'm just going to paraphrase it in the interest of time, but that piggybacks on this question. It's basically, do the community bylaws that are generated by this process that you described, Rachel, is there any effort to integrate them or have them feed into revising national laws and policies? And is that an avenue or a channel for greater women's participation in policymaking?
That's a really hard one, Marlon. I've been struggling in so many countries to even have them pass laws that protect community land rights. Literally in every time I review a country's laws, I have to write in like, what about women's land rights? There's only one tiny article here about women's land rights. What about, you know, and really like lawmakers are often men. And I think, and especially governments, they don't really want to do public commentary or public consultation processes. And I think that's a serious role for NGOs and women's cooperatives and civil society and women's savings groups and women MPs to really rally women to be included in public consultation meetings and hearings before laws and regulations are drafted. It's hard enough to get pro-community laws passed and implemented. And then even within that, it's hard to get women's voices heard. So I think it's a challenge for all of us in civil society. And I think this should go even beyond to like into schools and teachers. Like, how do we get girls to be, you know, involved in civics questions at an earlier and earlier age so they grow up to want to be leaders and they want to become MPs? Because I don't know, I mean, the systemic like exclusion of women from all lawmaking processes is absolutely societal. And for me, it's easier to get women involved at the local level. I mean, even in the United States, it's much easier for people to be on the PTA or the city council than it is to get involved in like lawmaking in Washington, DC. So I think it has to start at the ground level, and then you'll always see a trickle up effect. Women who speak out and are excellent at the community, move up to the district level, speak out at the district, decide to run for office at the province or the region. And I think that's one way we can really get more women's voices in lawmaking. But I personally think the public comment process, where laws must be shared with community members, is really a time for all of us to mobilize women's voices.
Thanks, Rachel. Is there anyone that wants to make a final comment on this point, to share their perspectives before we move on to there's another set of questions that I want to address. I'm just going to give a moment. Remember, you can click your hand, raise your hand, your virtual hand, in the panel, or you can write into the question panel. I just want to make sure we don't miss anyone's valuable contributions. Okay, Sonali, you're raising your hand.
I will unmute Sonali.
Okay, go ahead. Sonali, you are unmuted, so please go ahead and speak if you wish. Maybe some microphone problems?
While we're waiting for her, Tobias, can you put on the slide from Teresa just as background, because it's such a great visual?
Sure. I'm so glad you asked. I've been waiting to put it up.
Okay, it looks like potentially there's some issue with the microphone or entering the audio. So Sonali, if you could enter what you were going to say into the questions panel, and I will share it. I really appreciate that. Yeah, Tobias, I actually have a time check. I want to know how much time do we have left, because there's a lot of questions and I want to know if I have to summarize, group them together.
So I personally am comfortable with going over time, but you know, of course, I'm mindful of everyone's time. I want to respect that. But we could and formally end the webinar, but then continue the conversation and just keep the recording going as well. On my end, the only thing that I still wanted to do was to be sure to invite everyone to join the network if they're not already, and to let everyone know that we'll be in touch with the reminder invitation and to share the link to the full recording. So if you want to just continue the conversation, and then people can stay on if they want to, and they can drop off when they need to go, and then they can catch up by the recording later, or they can also reply to the forum post about this topic. So.
Okay, well, I'll try and wrap it up in the next like 10, 15 minutes. So the next area of questioning is to think about how a lot of this conversation and the examples used were very Africa focused, because of course that's where a lot of the kind of testing and piloting occurred. It makes sense, that's where a lot of the learnings arose. But we have a lot of colleagues from different areas of the world. If Stella Wong, if you're able to speak or connect, if we can unmute her. She has some questions about how these learnings can be applied or addressed in particularly the Mekong region. But Stella, if you could maybe give us a little bit more context about the type of work that you're doing and how you might be interested in applying some of these lessons that might help get a better answer to the question. Sorry, Tobias, you can unmute her.
I missed the name of the person that you wanted to unmute.
Stella, well, actually, I just did it. Stella, go ahead. You're unmuted. Stella.
By the way, also, David has his hand raised, just so you're aware.
Okay. All right. I'm very sad. So
Stella is unmuted, and her microphone is green. So Stella, why don't you try to speak and see if we can hear you?
Hello, can you hear me?
Great.
Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm actually pretty new to this area. So I'm actually wondering if there's any examples of like adapting this by law drafting here in the Mekong region.
Maybe
is there any work like going on?
Maybe you can give us a little bit of just the context. Is there an area you're particularly working on, or communities you're particularly working on, or particular challenges that you're facing?
I'm actually pretty interested in like Laos. So I'm just wondering if there's any work like of Namati like going on in Laos right now regarding like bylaws drafting.
Okay. Rachel, do you have, I know that you've built a stronger network across Asia working on some of these techniques.
I actually have no particular knowledge about how to address this in the Mekong region. We have found that community bylaws drafting has been incredibly successful in Myanmar and the groups we've worked with there. And I just had an amazing, I was just working with the most amazing group, JKPP in Indonesia, and they're going to be integrating some bylaws into their mapping work. But I have not really worked in the Mekong region and don't have good answers for you. I apologize. Maybe other people on the call would.
Okay. But you have seen it succeed in other parts of Asia, at least in neighboring areas, that potentially there could be. Are there some resources or groups or initiatives that perhaps Stella could look to for reference?
Not that I know off the top of my head. I apologize.
All right, well, we'll continue to think on it, Stella, and potentially follow up with you afterwards. David, would you like to contribute? You are now unmuted, so if you would like to speak, feel free. David Arak, who had his hand raised, but looks like it went down again. David?
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. I would like to underscore what Rachel presented, especially on women land rights with respect to customary tenure in Africa. So in Uganda with LEMU, a study was conducted on 512 widows, and I'll just share some statistics from this study. Of the 512 widows who were interviewed, 72 had left their marital home, and about 15 were claiming both the marital home and where they had settled after, while 425 remained in their marital homes. Now, the 72 who had left cited reasons such as persecution and threats from family members of the marital home. Others also cited reasons such as they wanted to remarry and they didn't feel comfortable to do that in the marital homes, while others cited that the land had been grabbed by relatives, close relatives. So the study also went ahead to ascertain how, under customary tenure, to be specific in Uganda, the widows acquired land, and about 64% mentioned that they acquired land upon marriage, that the land was given to them by the maiden home. So the woman and the husband were given land, so it was family land. Some others, a few mentioned that they cleared land, cleared the bush or forest and settled. Only about 11% stated that they had bought land. That means most of them inherited land. So the women were asked, who are these people that are involved in conflict, or the people who are grabbing land? And a majority, over 80%, stated that the brothers-in-law or stepson or stepdaughter, like these are very close people. And so the conclusion and the analysis from this was suggesting that the whole pressure on individualization of land is actually security of tenure and marginalization of women, especially in decision making and influence of issues around land, is a secondary result of the pressure on individualization. So as everyone is talking of individualization of land, there's a lot of anxiety built in the society, and especially the male members who should have acted as provided security. So everyone is rushing to acquire something for himself. Like for me, it's about individualization. So this study concluded that the pressure for individualization of land is further marginalizing and forcing women and making them more vulnerable. Not only women, orphans as well, and people who are adopted into families. So everyone starts to say you were just adopted, you're not a member of the family, so therefore you don't have rights, you can't make decisions over land. So I just thought I should share this as well to reinforce the aspect of customary tenure, to be specific in Africa and Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That leads me into another question, this challenge about inheritance. Danny Weinhout, if you're online still, I'm looking, yes, you are. I want to summarize a question, but if you could, pose it and add context of your own. He was asking about comparative experience as well across, in this case, Africa and Mozambique. He notes that all lane pertains to the state. If in other countries, families own land, but if the inheritance practices are very weak and discriminatory against women, what are ways in which this approach can be adjusted for that? Danny, if you're online, I've just unmuted you. So please feel free to elaborate on your question, because I think, as David was saying, this is a very, very important issue.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes, greetings from the Netherlands. Yeah, my question was related to the presentation of Rachel, and for me it was not very clear. It was about work being done in Africa and what countries had been covered. Maybe I missed it. And yeah, I think the land tenure systems differ a lot. Between countries, and even within one country like Uganda, you can have a number of different customary practices and systems that are being followed. So one of the questions is how you can compare, and secondly, she emphasized the family ownership, which for me is not very common to hear about, because usually it's individual ownership, or sometimes a couple may own, a man and a woman, and community ownership, or like in Mozambique you have community demarcation of communal lands. So I was a bit puzzled by the family perspective. In a nutshell, that were my questions. Thank you.
Danny. Rachel, do you want to address some of those clarifications?
Sure. The whole term ownership is very much a construct. The bundle of rights in ownership is, it allows use, it allows access, it allows transfer, it allows bequeathing, etc. There's a number of rights in the term ownership. In Mozambique, which is quote unquote owns all the land, but for all intents and purposes, at the community level, the way it's used, managed, administered, transacted among community members, that's where this kind of intervention takes place, which is that, and Mozambique, unfortunately, I tried for many, many years when I was living here to see if I could figure out a way to, get a bylaws process into the otherwise very, very excellent Mozambique land law. But essentially, the community delimitation process in Mozambique, where the community has to resolve its boundary conflicts, map its lands, elect a new governing council that includes women, and do all these things that are according to Mozambican law. It doesn't include a process of the community deciding as a group how it wants to manage its lands and resources. And so in a place like that, I would say it's up to NGOs or county governments that can write additional laws, or provincial governments that can write additional law, regulations, et cetera, to try to create a platform, or even just NGOs outside of the law to create a platform for deliberative democracy, because that's what really the bylaws drafting process is. It's a process of the community sitting down together and saying, how do we want to govern our lands and resources? How do we want to make sure that 7 generations into the future, our great-grandchildren, et cetera, are prospering? How do we want to treat women? How do we want to treat minorities in our community? And sitting down and writing rules. And that can be done really by any community, whether the law asks for it or not. And what I was learning last week in Kenya with all these amazing land advocates is that even if the law doesn't allow for communities to write their own bylaws or constitutions or rules, the community can write them anyway and get them stamped by any government official who's willing to stamp them. The Minister of Culture might do it, the Minister of Gender might do it, et cetera, et cetera. Just something to make these rules more official. And if an investor comes, the community can show these rules and say, here's our rules, this is how you deal with us. Or if a woman is getting kicked off her land, she can point to the rules and say, we all agreed 5 years ago or 10 years ago or last year, this is how we treat women who are being evicted from their lands. So it's not really a matter of state ownership versus individual ownership. What I'm talking about is a process where rules for its own comportment. And in terms of family land, I would disagree with you. I would say the majority of land is owned by families. I would say my parents' land is not just owned by my parents, it's owned by them and me and my sister and our children, et cetera. And in most cultures I've ever lived in rural areas, entire extended families own land together and live on land together. It's only when you get to urban areas where only a man and a woman or a man owns the land. I think that's actually like proportionally in the world a very, very, very rare thing. It's more in Western countries and cities, but otherwise, or if someone has bought land, usually it's bought by an individual or a couple, but if land is inherited, it usually runs through a whole entire family line. And I think, in my humble opinion, I haven't done enormous research. I would say that's the majority of land in the rural world.
Mm. Thank you. So it seems that regardless of the regulatory structure that the formal kind of state system might overlay on land ownership, that bundle of rights still often revolves around family. But even regardless of that, this process that you delineated, it could still apply regardless of what the kind of formal the formal laws delineate. That's very useful to know. I'm going to just move on to the final thread of questions. And I'm going to combine a little bit of what Christina was observing, Christina Agenter. And again, Sonali, we finally, maybe the microphone didn't work, but we have some kind of questions from Sonali from the pane. But they essentially deal with power dynamics between women and men. So the one thing that Christina observed was that in the graph that you showed, Rachel, there was a high response from men that said they trusted community and community leaders to ensure effective protection of land rights of vulnerable groups more than women. And Sonali notes that laws, policies, and political will might be positive, but unless we address the patriarchy, essentially, enduring against women, how can we really move forward? So maybe if you could speak a little towards how you address, really deeply ingrained power dynamics in this work, aside from kind of the laws, policies, bylaws, all of that process.
I mean, Sonali, I completely agree with you. Like, down with the patriarchy, yes. I think we absolutely have to address patriarchy, but it's so nuanced at the local level, right? Like, you go into these communities, you have to remember, most people that were born in that community, they're going to die in that community. They know each other. They know each other's business. They drive each other nuts. They love each other like family. It's so intimate. And I think for those of us who don't spend our entire lives in small rural villages, we honestly can't understand. But we can imagine, right? And so in my imagination, the way I think it happens is that some young woman has a ton of power and sense of confidence, and she decides to speak up, and she decides to run for office, or she decides to fight for a right that she knows is hers in the national constitution, and then she enrolls other women in the community. Or maybe some woman decides she's going to run for office and be the first woman in her village to take a role, or maybe some NGO comes to town and forms a women's cooperative, a savings cooperative, and the women savings cooperative start discussing. I think even if NGOs didn't even show up, women are powerful. Women run their families. Women run the economy in so many places. They do so much work. And I think that smartphones and the internet and radio and television have a capacity to wake people up and give them a felt sense of power to start doing things that are out of the ordinary. And I think in every community, there's a tipping point. I think I'm kind of embarrassed speaking by myself because this is a really deep, rich debate. I would love to hear what other people have to think. Like, how do we overturn the patriarchy in small rural villages? It's a hard question, but I think it's happening. We just got some data back from rural Liberia, this midline data, and it turned out that men and women's opinions about women's rights were actually much closer to each other's than different, and more men than I expected were like, yeah, women have rights, yeah, women have land rights, even in places where in the control groups where they hadn't been massively supported by an NGO. So I think, in most of the places where I work, 50% of the population is under the age of 20. And these people have grown up their entire lives with the internet and with different access to information and media. And I think things are going to start shifting in ways we can't understand yet.
Thank you so much.
But really, that's like, there's so much more to be said on the topic.
And that's my final call out, especially on this issue, but on any issue that we discuss before we close. Does anyone who's attending here, we have now there's 22 people. Before we close, are there any closing thoughts that people would like to share, or even any kinds of observations, celebrations, jokes, anything before we close? I do want to give the space and the floor to everyone who's kind of given their time to join us today. I'll just wait for about half a minute or so. And if you have something to share, raise your hand or put something in the questions pane. Okay. I think we're ready to close. Tobias, if you could take it away.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, all the participants who took the time to join us today, and those of you who asked questions, and the intrepid ones who asked their questions with their voices. Thank you, Abby, for moderating this very interesting discussion. I will apologize for the technical difficulties. And I'll work on my systems for future webinars to make sure these things don't happen again. You'll be hearing from me again tomorrow with some more information about the network, about this webinar, the link to the recording for the webinar. If you're not already a member of the network, please join at namati.org/network. And we have a topic in our forum for this webinar. And I know that there's so much more that we could be talking about on this subject. And many questions were only touched on. And so if you are still feeling, passionate about the topic and you want to continue the conversation, we would love to join you in that. Go ahead, Abby.
Yeah, Paul Ando does have a few lines, and that's a place, Paul, if you're still listening, the topic in discourse that Tobias is describing, that's a great place for us to continue. He had a specific question about how we can engage, or how you can engage with Namati at the local level to undertake community land rights documentation. I would point you to the facilitator's guide that Rachel discussed, but let's continue talking on the topic. I just wanted to make sure he posted another question. I want to make sure he didn't feel ignored.
Great. Well, I'll see you all on the forum, and perhaps at a future webinar. We can do a follow-up webinar on this topic if there's interest. Just let us know. So it's been a great pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your Valentine's Day, and we'll talk to you all very soon. Thanks all so much. I'm going to end the webinar now.